think I'm so crazy, but we're just going green. People think we're so crazy, but we're just going green. People think that we're so crazy, we're just going green. People think that we're so crazy, we're just going green.
And a very good afternoon, Phuket. It is indeed it's been a wet weekend, it looks like, with the balance of the storm coming through from the cyclone that's heading up towards Burma. But aside from that, it's a wonderful weekend. I'm here in the studio today, and thanks for joining us. It is, in fact, show number 74, Going Green. And I'm in the studio today with Jeremy Tang from Hong Kong. Jeremy, welcome.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me on the show.
Jeremy is an old buddy of mine and has been in Hong Kong for the best part of 2 decades, 3 decades?
3 decades now.
Even 4 decades?
No, I'm not that old.
3 decades. And Jeremy has been involved since the early 90s in some of the most exciting startups in Asia on the retail side, and has a great wealth of experience bringing international brands to the Asian market, and in particular starting up the Chinese market. Jeremy, tell us a little bit about your background and where you are today in retail.
Born in Australia, but ended up moving to Hong Kong when I was 12 years old and been there ever since. My first foray into retail was working for a gentleman, David Tang, now Sir David Tang, where we started a company called Shanghai Tang, which was an interesting business. We tried to create the first Chinese fashion brand, the first Chinese lifestyle brand. And there I got a taste of developing products from ground zero, literally from sketches all the way through to finished product and retail. So it was great exposure to the full supply chain, which I think is something we're going to talk about this afternoon.
Indeed, that ended up being a very successful retail operation. It was sold to a European company.
Yeah, Richemont in 2000.
But, and I say there was a but, there were some issues, I know, in the early days with the business model, and as all retail, it's very tricky to find out exactly what the consumer wants, and in many cases can take a decade to get it right. But of course, the new business, this new business 3.0, as we are now, 2013, 400 parts per million was the CO2 content last week that was the highest ever recorded. So in a changing world, people don't have 10 years these days to get their retail strategies right. They have to be much more adaptable, they have to be quicker, and they have to be much more progressive in their forward thinking.
Yeah, I think all retail today, the velocity of change has increased dramatically. Retailers really need to listen to their customers. They really need to understand what's happening at the store level to stay ahead of the curve, or try to stay ahead of the curve. And I think this whole issue of sustainability and environmental footprint is a great example of that. Retail, or leading retailers, having a chance to set a precedent in the industry by taking this opportunity to create green products and reviewing the way that they operate, reviewing their entire footprint to keep ahead of the curve.
When we come back after the break, we're going to be talking about some fun things here on retail, but one of those is sustainable retail in itself as a concept. Is it not an oxymoron? Yeah,
very tough. Exhaustive topic. I don't know if we have enough time for that today. We might need a few more sessions.
Very good. Well, we're going to go through and take a look at what is new retail these days, how businesses are moving from risk mitigation through to treating it as an opportunity. We're going to be talking about the uptick in stakeholder engagement. We're seeing that particularly here in Phuket, where retailers are engaging the community, engaging consumers, and even engaging NGOs to support them in their sustainable strategy. And we'll be talking about changing consumer habits, and indeed for the consumer and for the planet, we are indeed in a race against time. And we'll be looking at what it is that consumers, and you in particular, can do perhaps to change some of your habits and making Phuket a greener and cleaner environment. Thanks, Jeremy. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a moment.
This is Going Green with Nick Anthony on Live 89.5.
Welcome back to the Going Green Show. It's show number 74. I'm here in the studio with Jeremy Tang this afternoon. Jeremy, thanks for joining us, and welcome again to Phuket.
Thanks.
You've been coming to Phuket for many years.
Yeah.
When was your first time?
Around 30 years ago, I came here with my family for a holiday in Laguna.
Okay, and those last 30 years, we've seen Phuket changing from what was just a coconut and beach massage destination to actually now becoming quite a sophisticated retail environment. We've got centrally here, we've got every major retailer that's in Thailand is basically already here in Phuket. We have seen a proliferation of particularly the small shops, the 7-Elevens and Tesco's, as an example. In Kamala, I know where you're staying, there's 5 7-Elevens in a community of 2,500 people, plus the Tesco's, plus the Big C, and others coming. We're getting to the point, firstly, where we're seeing saturation in the retail market.
I don't think we've reached saturation by any means in Phuket. I think the emergence of organised retail here creates an opportunity to come up with sustainable plans that integrate what these retailers are doing with sustainable tourism. I think with these modern retailers like Central Group, and you mentioned some of the convenience store chains, there really is an opportunity for the tourist sector to reach out and come up with programs to work hand in hand with retailers. In particular, over the issue of litter, which I know is a major concern for you and your Seek group.
The plastic pollution, in particular here on the island, is one of our major problems. The net effect of litter, which is direct result of consumerization, particularly the mini marts and small plastic bags, goes straight onto the beaches. With these winds, goes right into the ocean. Of course, then either it gets eaten by dugongs or dolphins or turtles, where they died because the plastic takes away the space in the stomach for food, or we see that plastic, as we have now with these westerly winds, coming up on our beaches, and of course tourists looking at a beach littered with plastic doesn't go down very well. So it actually threatens our very model of tourism, which is our breadbasket here.
Well, first of all, I don't think you're going to ever eliminate plastic as a part of the retail supply chain. It will always be there.
Mm-hmm.
There's no real substitute for plastic. But what we need to do is come up with programs that either minimise the impact of plastic, minimise the amount of plastic in the supply chain, or manage how plastic is used in the supply chain. And I think this also comes back to the concept of cradle to grave to cradle, which basically means that instead of just developing a product and selling it, the retailer or the brand has a responsibility to design, develop a product with the next generation of use in mind. How are they going to use that product beyond its consumer life cycle to recycle it, reuse the raw materials? So there are probably a lot of opportunities in Phuket to come up with programs at the localized level to educate people about managing their consumption of plastics, the consumption of consumer goods, and taking a longer term view. Maybe it's an analogy, maybe the sort of the Buddhist view, to make sure that these things have an ongoing life cycle and it doesn't just end when you throw it in the trash.
The ideal of closed loop strategies is obviously where we need to head to. In the past, taking a look at Phuket as an example, we've had very limited recycling facilities. Almost 100% of everything that's been thrown away is incinerated, at least in the past. And we've only seen in the last couple of years now what we call pickers, the local community that go through and check out the bins and they pull out the plastic and the aluminium cans and whatever else can be recycled. But until that was in place, there was effectively no recycling on Phuket. Now, retailers will tell you it's the responsibility of the consumer. They just create the products, they sell the products, and it's really up to the consumer then what he does with those products. But there is increasing interest, as you say, from retailers on this cradle to grave, realizing the opportunity in waste, partially. There is an economic benefit to recycling. Plastics are made out of oil, and the type of recycling that's available these days for plastics recycling is making it much more efficient to convert those waste products back into plastic feedstock, creating a resource again. Are there examples now of retailers that are aggressively taking this cradle-to-grave strategy in place and managing better their waste streams ahead of consumer waste?
Yeah, well, I mean, brands, at the end of the day, communicate with customers through retail, and at least in terms of point of purchase, and there's an opportunity there for them to be responsible and innovative about the way that they work with consumers. So an example might be Nike. In 1993, they set up a program to ensure to promote the reuse of old shoes. So they would grind up the soles of the shoes and use it to lay sports track. And that can be done at a local level. You could initiate a program here in Phuket where you collect X thousands of shoes, I'm not sure what the quantity would be, and you could have somebody like Nike step in and help to create a running track or a football field for the local community. That would be a good example of a retailer taking the lead. But obviously when it comes to consumer products, a little bit trickier. We did that beach clean yesterday. We were picking up rubbish. Possibly half of that rubbish was FMCG product. So in that case, is it the FMCG company or the retailer that has a responsibility to promote education and community? I mean, I would argue both. I would say that the Unilevers and Procter & Gamble's and Coca-Colas of the world, Red Bulls of the world, have a responsibility to try and ensure they minimize the litter impact on the island. But I think that the retailers also have a responsibility. I mean, another example of that is the fast food industry. A lot of waste, packaging waste, etc. in fast food. I know in some countries there's a growing movement with legislation, governments, municipal governments, etc., to get the fast food outlets to provide bins within a certain radius of each fast food outlet. So you go in, you buy your hamburger, etc. As you walk to your car, as whatever you're doing, as you walk away from the outlet, there are bins available, branded, great opportunity for the fast food company to create an association with their customer, and they encourage you to throw all your waste in a bin as opposed to throw it on the street, which unfortunately does happen.
It does happen indeed. There is an example, briefly before we take a break, of that type of recycling here. There's a lady called Kun Gun who runs a green NGO called Greenfins, and they do many beach cleanups and also coordinated reef cleanups. And she's been collecting flip-flops for the last 4 or 5 years. And she actually grinds those flip-flops down, and it goes into a mulch, a little bit like what you're talking about with Nike. And she makes plastic cushion squares which are used for kids' playgrounds under swings and under slides. So,
well, I think this is a good point, that these sustainability initiatives and these environmental initiatives at the retail level can happen with companies like Walmart, one of the largest retailers in the world, obviously, or the largest retailer in the world, all the way down to local boutiques. You know, you don't have to be big to make a difference when it comes to retail and environmental CSR programs.
Very good. Stay tuned. You're with Jeremy Tang and Nick Anthony talking about sustainable retail. We'll be back after the break.
This is Going Green with Nick Anthony on Live 89.5.
Welcome back. Good afternoon to the Going Green show number 74. I'm in the studio with Jeremy Tang, who's in from Hong Kong, also by way of Cuba, I might add. That's a long way for you, Jeremy, from Cuba.
Yeah, not an environmentally friendly way to travel.
It's not indeed. We're talking about sustainable retail and, in fact, how there is a race against time, as we've been talking on the show, in terms of the available resources of the planet. I gave a fairly shocking statistic last week that was saying that globally forests are being lost at a rate of 36 football fields per minute. Let me repeat that again. 36 football fields of environmental beauty are being lost every minute on the planet through the degradation, a lot of that through palm oil, a lot of that through different types of farming, and of course deforestation for logging. If you look at the consumer chain and consumer products, so much of what is produced today has excess packaging. There's a huge amount of excess waste throughout the entire transportation process, including, of course, the fossil fuel use in transportation, bringing a nice bar of chocolate from Switzerland. Jeremy, in terms of the type of moves that you're seeing in Asia, is Asia in general still a long way behind Europe or in Australia, where, of course, you're from?
Well, I think in general, most Asian countries are behind the curve compared to Australia, but I think what is happening is that they're playing catch-up very, very quickly. And China's a great example of that, where consumer awareness, consumer trends, etc., are really happening at 2 or 3 times the speed of other historical consumer markets like the States and Australia. So that is encouraging in the sense that there's a strong growing awareness around environmentalism and CSR, but it's also alarming in the sense that, you know, you've got this huge emergence of a huge urbanization coupled with a huge emergence of middle class, and that middle class will want to consume. They will want to buy white goods, fridges, TVs, consumer products. They want to buy a car. They want to consume like we have historically in Australia over the last 20 years. And if and when that happens, we're going to put incredible strain on our resources. In those emerging markets, there's an opportunity for retailers to take the lead, to learn from the mistakes in some of the other developed markets, implement programs today to make that impact on the world a little less dramatic. But, again, it's a very complex problem. We talked about this earlier. It's not just a question of individual retailers making small changes. We need a cohesive approach to this across the whole consumer industry. It's a very complex problem.
Here on Phuket, we've been fighting for a reduction, particularly in plastic bags, for the last 4 years. We came very close 3 years ago to getting a blanket ban on plastic bags across Phuket. However, we were hampered by one of the major global retailers that at the time were not prepared to sign a voluntary reduction in plastic bags and indeed a voluntary ban on plastic bags. And as a result of that, all of the other retailers that had agreed to join this campaign then said, well, if they're not joining, we're not joining. So we've had now a nearly 3-year delay on banning single-use plastic bags on Phuket. There has been a strategy put in place by retailers that is reducing plastic use, but it's not been as strong as we would have liked. That said, however, 3 years ago there was no discussion with retailers on Phuket, typical ones, 7-Eleven, Tesco, etc., on initiating a sustainable retail plan on Phuket. Today, 2013, the environment is much different. Tesco, 7-Eleven, Big C, Macro have now banned all plastic bags. They're the first ones here on Phuket to do so. But we're seeing interest and we're seeing demand from the retailers to really integrate this sustainability plan into also their own CSR program. So we're seeing it coming from the top down through the store into the staff and with education of staff, which is of course critical, and through that better education to the consumer. However, I must say, 9 times out of 10 when you go to a shop and you say that you don't want a plastic bag, in the old days, they would certainly look at you with one eye thinking you're pretty crazy. Today, only about half of them do that.
Yeah, no, I noticed that myself actually when I bought something yesterday and I said no to the plastic bag that I just carry a couple of pieces out. The lady actually smiled. She thought it was nice that I was doing that, you could tell. But coming back to the catalyst for change, I think you mentioned retailers as a driver. Obviously, when I say retailers, I also mean brands, which are ultimately going to drive the process from a supply chain point of view. You also have initiatives from government, which I think is a key issue in places like Australia, or a key catalyst in places like Australia for real change. And then last, but probably the most important, is the consumer. The consumer needs to change the way that they think, the way that they consume. Consumer behavior needs to change to really make a difference. And I think that coming back to the brands and the retailers, some retailers are doing this because they want to be innovative. They really have it within the fibre of their brand, within their culture, to be innovative and to make differences, to make a difference. But there are other retailers out there or other brands out there that may be doing it for different reasons. They may be doing it as a part of their overall marketing message, which is a little cynical but sometimes true. They may be doing it because they understand if they don't move, that legislation is going to come in and change the way they do business anyway. So it's maybe a financial or a strategic move rather than doing it altruistically for the good of the planet. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter why they're doing it, as long as they're making a change and making changes to the way they operate. I think for all brands, all retailers, for them to really do this properly, they need to appoint a CSR director, CSR manager at the top level of the company,
at director level,
board level, because these programs aren't individual. It's not. I don't want to belittle the plastic bag issue, but it's not just about recycling plastic bags or banning plastic bags. It's not just about green buildings and changing light bulbs in your stores or turning up the temperature gauges on your air conditioning. It's got to be looked at holistically. It's got to be looked at in terms of the entire supply chain and the way that the brand interacts with the consumer. Everything from where they source their raw materials all the way through to the way products are reused, recycled or repaired. And at the moment, that is happening with some companies, but it's not happening enough. It's being done slightly cosmetically, where they pick off individual programs, individual problems, and address those and tout them as green-friendly type CSR programs, etc., etc. But really, for it to be done properly, you need to look at the whole organization, all the touch points within a company, within the supply chain, within your staff, within your shareholders, stakeholders, as to how your brand interacts with the environment, interacts with the community. Difficult, really, very, very challenging problem.
Stay tuned. We'll be back with Jeremy talking about sustainable retail. We're going to be looking at consumer changes and habits here on Phuket, and we'll be talking about water, one of the flashpoints of retail. Nick Anthony, Jeremy Tang, you're on Going Green, show number 74. Stay tuned.
This is Going Green with Nick Anthony on Live 89.5.
And a very good afternoon. We're on Going Green, show number 74, and Jeremy Tang's in the studio with me today. Jeremy's all the way in from Hong Kong, actually been enjoying Phuket for the last couple of weeks, and I'm pleased to hear that he's been noticing some changes around our island. Jeremy, is our island looking a little cleaner?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I think Phuket still has that charm, that tropical island charm, which some other islands, unfortunately, in Asia have lost or have not managed as well. Phuket has a real opportunity, I think, to be a leader here in the Asian archipelagos, within the Asian archipelagos in terms of a tourist destination. And I'm really happy to see all these initiatives that are going on at the grassroots level here. It's really encouraging.
The change does come, and change does come, however, often a little bit too slowly. We're going to, later in the show, I'll talk a little bit about the green clubs that are being set up around Phuket, which is enabling community change and grassroots change. And that comes back a little bit to our discussion here on the consumer, where if, at the end of the day, retailers are not doing enough, if, at the end of the day, governments are not doing enough, then the changes that are going to need to take place are going to have to be individual level. That comes down to all of us as consumers, whether we're consuming food, whether we're consuming energy, or whether we're consuming items such as clothing or disposable items such as plastic bags. Whatever they are, you, I, people that are listening, we're the consumers, actually have the power to change. And there seems to be an evolving agenda, particularly on the planetary side, regarding consumers. And it seems that at the moment that has not yet been cracked. We continue in general around the planet to believe it's the 1980s. The demand from India and China and these places that have this growing middle income population are all demanding more space and bigger houses and, you know, the things that we've grown up with in the West. Many people will say that it's not for us to tell people that they can't have these items, but clearly there's going to be an issue where there simply isn't the resources to give every single person on the planet a car and a fridge and a TV.
We're going to have to adapt. Consumers are going to have to adapt. The expectations are going to have to adapt for this to become sustainable, practical. I think you touched on a couple of different topics there. I think we can look at consumers in a couple of different ways. I mean, maybe one is just simple demographics. If you talk to the younger generations today, I think the level of awareness is almost startling for me anyway. I know my nephews in Australia know as much about consumerism and environmentalism and social responsibility as I did when I was in my 20s or 30s, until I started to sort of take a personal interest in the topic. So that's really encouraging. But unfortunately, for those people to then become consumers themselves, you know, a 12, 13-year-old child to be making consumer decisions about cars and TVs and everything else, we're talking about another 10 years, a decade. I think for the sort of middle-aged consumer segment, there is a lot more awareness today, and I'm encouraged by this, than you would have had 10 years ago. So the consumer awareness is there, but I think my point is that there's a lead time to that, translating into retail sales and the way that people buy at the retail level. And unfortunately, I don't think we have that much time. I think the impact on the environment is happening every day. So we need to try and accelerate that process, or retailers and brands need to accelerate that process, but it's a difficult thing to do, very challenging thing to do. In Phuket, you really do, coming back to what I said earlier, you have an opportunity to almost position Phuket as the sustainable island in Asia, to create an example of how this can work, how you can have a fairly large local population, highly, with a very strong degree of tourism, etc., working together to create sustainable programs either at the macro level or the micro level, working with individual retailers, individual boutiques, fishermen, local communities, etc., or working with the retail giants like Tesco or Coca-Cola, some of the large FMCG companies. You've got a real opportunity here to make a difference, and hopefully that could then be used as a test bed for other Asian islands where they haven't necessarily had the people like yourself driving change.
There was an article in the press this week talking about a survey in the US, and they did a retail little test case where they sold sustainable socks. And on the one hand, it said that the material and the quality and the production facilities and the making of these particular brand of socks was sustainable. And it was offered at the same price as the brand next to it, which came from the Bangladesh factory, for example, that just fell down. The consumer response currently in the US was 50% when there was no price differential, they would make that sustainable choice. But if there was any price differential, they would go with the cheaper version. So clearly, from a consumer perspective, price is still and will I'm sure ongoing be one of the main reasons for purchase, not necessarily the choice of sustainability. So if it's left to the consumer to make this decision and the consumer is not making that decision, then that has to come back to the retailer to make these decisions for them. Now,
or government.
Given the state of or lack of current controls that governments put on the retail sector, it means that it's basically running amok. Right now, there are very few good examples of retailers that are making these hard decisions for consumers. Is that pretty fair comment?
I would say that generally, yes. There are, let's take the old 80-20 rule. I think that 20% of retailers and brands, not just retailers, brands out there are trying to make a difference. 80% are following. But that's encouraging because 10, 15 years ago you wouldn't even have had those numbers. But in terms of the price elasticity, if that's the right way to describe it, for these decisions, that's a very difficult question. I know I have a friend of mine working with a very large utility company in Australia. They offered a green program for their energy where consumers could make the choice to tick between regular coal-fired powered energy or to pay premium and buy green energy. And they were very disappointed with the take-up, although, again, Australians are very environmentally conscious. When it actually came to putting their hand in their wallets, to voting with their wallets, there was a disappointing response for this program that was initiated. So there is still that barrier. How much are people really willing to pay to go green? How much are people really willing to sacrifice to go green? And where does that ultimate responsibility lie? Does it lie with the consumer? Does it lie with the retailer, the brand, or does it lie with government? Or what I believe is it's a combination of all three. They have to work together. And again, unfortunately, there is a lead time to all of that. You have to build through education, build through social awareness, etc., as to the impact that consumerism has on the environment.
Stay tuned. I'm with Jeremy Tang, and this is Going Green, show number 74. We'll be back in a moment, just talk a little bit about some new retail concepts, and we'll take a look at a couple of other examples around the world of some retailers that are doing good. Sustainable retail. Stay tuned.
People think we're so crazy, but we're just going green. People think we're so crazy, but we're just going green. People think that we're so crazy, we're just going green. People think that we're so crazy, we're just going green.
This is Nick Anthony. I'm in the studio with Jeremy Tang, and we're on Going Green, show number 74, talking about sustainable retail. We've been talking about the role of the consumer, we've been talking about the role of big business, talking about the role of government, and looking collectively at the sort of changes that are going to be needed in the future to reduce consumption, to bring it to a level of sustainability. And as the numbers, as we discussed last week, have been pretty shocking, we're currently consuming, with the rate of consumption we have, the equivalent of 2 planets. We don't have 2 planets, we only have Earth. So over the next 20 years, with a huge bulge in population that is coming through the pipeline, and the emerging demographics of the middle class in India or in China, and generally across Asia, as well as in places like Russia and Africa, are having a massive demand-led resurgence, if you will, on retail products and demand for retail products. So there is a real conundrum in the planet today on how to provide those products in a sustainable way. And it's not a very easy thing. It seems generally, Jeremy, that the role of retail in promoting and enabling sustainable consumption really has yet to be cracked, as we just discussed. It seems the current attention and effort is mainly on making today's retail models as sustainable as possible, but less activity on new retail business models. We have groups like Whole Foods in the US. I follow them reasonably closely in some of their initiatives, and the promotion, which is something that's required here, for example, of sustainable seafood, is a critical and really missing piece of the puzzle here in Asia. the demand for seafood in Asia and China in particular through Hong Kong is insatiable. And they are absolutely raping every single coral reef on the planet to provide enough large garupas for their dinner tables. Indeed, we've seen the same thing with shark's fin and all sorts of other marine animals. Whole Foods have a nice model where they do give consumers a lot of information about labels, about packaging, about materials, about ingredients, and in seafood, a very comprehensive information strategy to consumers about what is sustainable seafood and what is not. Here in Asia, again, getting back to these retailers, what's going to be this tipping point? I'm struggling to find, the one thing that's perhaps going to shock people to change their habits. Maybe it's something simple like water. We're going to have a crisis of water over the next 5 to 10 years, and that is going to have a massive effect globally. Maybe that's one of the things that will tweak the retail sector to be a little bit more sustainable.
Well, I think this issue of tipping point applies not just to retail and consumerism. I think it applies to this whole environmental issue that we're discussing as a whole. Global warming, all of those issues. Unfortunately, I hate to say this, but maybe the world does need a little bit of shock therapy on some of these things. If we really do wipe out swordfish and tuna in the next 5, 10 years, maybe that's a tipping point towards ensuring sustainable fishing for whatever's left. But in terms of consumerism, again, I think the problem is too complex to come up with one silver bullet that is going to suddenly make everybody wake up tomorrow and realize they need to change the way they consume. Not just the consumers, but the brands, the way that they develop products, the way that they approach their whole business model. I really don't think there is a silver bullet to this. I think it's up to us up to the individuals to do whatever they can, up to individual brands and individual retailers to do whatever they can, up to government and legislation to do whatever they can, and hopefully collectively that is enough momentum to make a difference. But there are some examples of this shock type situations. I remember Nike were embroiled in all sorts of scandals with their supply chain 10 odd years ago when they came up with their initiative.
Sweatshops.
With sweatshops, etc. Yeah. I think this factory in Bangladesh and in Dhaka, unfortunately that collapsed. If Gap had been the lead client for that factory, I'm sure that would have created a big social backlash, which then would have
actually Gap were one of the main clients, and Gap are one of the few brands that now have not signed an agreement to support a higher per day wage. Somewhat surprisingly for Gap, I thought.
Yeah, but that issue is probably about minimum wage and CSR as opposed to pure environmentalism. Mm. But again, we haven't touched on really the supply chain issues in this show so far. But you have to remember that when we talk about retailers don't necessarily control their entire supply chain. They may work through agents, like a company I originally consulted for, Li & Fung, and Li & Fung then managed relationships with all the factories. And those factories may be subcontracted, and beyond those factories you have suppliers of raw materials. So if you really get into true CSR programs for retailers, it really is quite a complex, it's a very long chain that you need to go back and assess and evaluate on a continuous basis. So I can understand how Gap could end up buying product from this factory in Bangladesh. I'm not saying they should not be aware of that, but in some cases they may not have been aware that was a subcontracted supplier. Mm-hmm. I think Gap, as an example, have a social responsibility to do full audits of their supply chain, but that supply chain is dynamic. People switch factories, they switch suppliers all the time. It's a moving monster or octopus that they need to keep track of. And to ensure that your products are 100% sustainable, etc., you need to have a dedicated resource within the company managing that. And for me, that again, it starts at the top within the organization. You need to have CSR built into senior management as a part of the overall holistic view on the way you're going to run your company. So you've got a top-down approach there, and then consumers can drive change. Consumers can demand change. But coming back to your original question, what's the tipping point for that? It's hard to say if there's one thing that will push consumers over the edge. I think shocks like the Dakar situation, yes. But in general, it's just a question of continuous education. I believe continuous education is the only way we're going to get there.
Stay tuned. Nick Anthony with Jeremy Tang in the studio. We're talking about sustainable retail. We'll be back after the break.
This is Going Green with Nick Anthony on Live 89.5.
Nick Anthony in the studio here with Jeremy Tang talking about sustainable retail, and just looking at a couple of the different programs, Jeremy, that we've seen, and maybe a few more examples. I saw the Coca-Cola advertisement this week, which was actually sponsored by Greenpeace, and the ad has a fairly typical sort of Coke-looking couple of individuals drinking out of their plastic bottles, fantastic bubbly sugar-filled Coca-Cola, and then a bird drops out of the sky, and then another bird drops out of the sky, and these birds start literally dying, dropping down in front of these people that are drinking from these plastic water bottles. And the inference is, of course, that plastic goes into the ocean, plastic breaks down eventually, and many of those particles, those small plastic pieces, are scooped up by seabirds that then take them back to their island, to their chicks, regurgitate the food, so-called food, into their babies' stomachs, and of course 80% or sometimes 100% of what they're collecting is in fact plastic pieces. So they're filling their babies with plastic. They go back to ocean to get some more food, and of course by the time they come back, their baby chicks are dead. This is happening on a place called Midway Island, as it is in many other places around the world, and it was, I thought, a fairly aggressive stance from Greenpeace, and certainly a more activist approach from them in trying to educate consumers, firstly on this topic of plastic water bottles. But perhaps that might be a strategy that we may see from more companies like Greenpeace.
Well, I think this is a question of education again. What they were trying to do, from what I understand, is explain to the consumers the footprint that these types of purchasing decisions actually have. So you decide to buy a can of Coke. What is the environmental footprint or impact when you buy that can of Coke, the bottle of Coke, plastic bottle of Coke? I mean, another good example of that is, hamburgers at McDonald's. How much rainforest has to be cut down in order to provide arable land for grazing cattle in order to make your hamburger? How much water do you need to use to dye a pair of jeans? When you actually look at some of these numbers, they're shocking. The consumer doesn't necessarily draw that connection between what they're doing at the retail level when they pull out their wallet versus the total impact that purchasing decision is making. So I think there are opportunities there to educate through a little bit of shock and awe, but I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the solution to this.
Let's take a look at something like Patagonia. They've created a number of good campaigns. More recently, an ability to resell your old Patagonia clothes through their website, which I thought was quite innovative and was quite forward-thinking. They seem to be a good example where one of their ad campaigns was "Don't buy this item." Actually, a slightly different approach. You don't need it, but if you do need a jacket, well, then this is the one to buy.
Less is more. I mean, overconsumption is definitely an issue. I mean, you see the best example I think of that is food, where you see people over-ordering, overeating food as a basic. But I think Patagonia, again, are probably a diamond in the rough, generally speaking, in terms of an example for all of us to look at. Their whole brand, the ethos, the DNA of their brand is built up around environmentalism and CSR, as opposed to other retail groups where you might say arguably it was reactionary rather than proactive to go green. I mean, I think example of that may be Walmart, where you've got the largest retailer in the world with $440 billion in sales, standing up, Lee Scott, the CEO, being very proud, announcing their sustainability program, $500 million US, an incredible amount of money going into sustainability projects. But at the end of the day, that only represents about 0.11% of their total sales volume. Whereas a company like Patagonia, I would argue, are probably reinvesting a significant portion of sales back into CSR and environmental programs and development. So again, the more that any company or any consumer does is good. I'm not discouraging any initiative, but I do think in the case of Patagonia, you've got companies doing it 100% for all the right reasons, and you can see that. It's reflected in everything the company does. Whereas there are other companies that may be doing it for slightly altruistic reasons or for marketing reasons or just to stay ahead of legislation. Again, they're moving in the right direction, but a lot more needs to be done, especially with these large retailers. I mentioned Walmart, Tesco's, as you mentioned, other retailers like that. There are so many things that they could do within that cradle to grave to cradle supply chain that the consumer wouldn't see. Coming back to your point about the bird and the impact on plastic bottles on the birds, there are so many things that happen within that supply chain the consumer is completely unaware of. I mean, things like packaging. We buy products at the supermarket, at the department store, and you have packaging, and quite often, at least I get turned off if there's too much packaging around a product. But for that product to get on the shelf, it's got to be transported in terms of raw materials, in terms of components, assembly, etc., testing, and all the way through that supply chain there's additional packaging, additional waste. You know, when people buy clothing hanging on a coat hanger or folded up on a shelf in a department store, quite often it's arrived there in a plastic bag, individually plastic wrapped. That's standard procedure for manufacturing clothes. So think about all of those plastic bags and all of that impact on the environment that has happened before it even gets into your plastic bag for you to take home. So, look, I remain positive about the things that are happening, especially with retailers that are leading this fight, like Patagonia. But it is a very complex problem, and it's something that really it's going to require really concerted efforts, not just from consumers, but from government and from brands and from retailers, to make a difference.
Very good. Jeremy Tang, thanks for joining us in the studio. Pleasure as always.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Thanks for having me in.
Great. And if you see anything that can be done here in Phuket, we're all ears and we're open for advice.
Great. Thanks.
And we always need someone to hassle a CEO. Very
okay,
good.
I'll do that for you.
Stay tuned. I'll be back in a moment with a quick wrap on some local news and talk about the beach cleaning schedule for this week. Nick Anthony, and that was Jeremy Tang here from Hong Kong talking about sustainable retail. Stay tuned.
This is Going Green with Nick Anthony on Live 89.5.
Nick Anthony back here on Going Green, and it's show number 74 today. Hope you're having a good afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about the green clubs that have been formed here on the west coast of Phuket in preparation for what's going to be a tough 6 months of westerly winds and trash back up on our beaches. We've been doing some beach cleanups last week all around the island. In particular, Jeremy and I were doing a beach cleanup down there in Kamala on what day are we today? Down on Thursday morning. Wednesday morning it was actually pretty clean. Thursday morning it was a trash dump again. The storm that came in on the way up to Burma has brought quite a bit of stuff off the oceans, and the result is about 50% being litter from households and about 50% litter coming off the fishing fleet, which includes ropes and bulbs and all sorts of Red Bull bottles and various other consumer stuff that these guys are throwing off their boats. We've started a program that will be monitoring the waste that is collected along the West Coast beaches. It's a program being done by the Ocean Conservancy and the ICC. We'll be tracking how many lighters, how many plastic straws, how many plastic bags, and extrapolating that out over the year. Hopefully next year we do similar numbers. It should show that there's been a reduction. Well, coming up, we have a couple of beach cleanups scheduled. You can go to the Kamala Green Club on Facebook and take a look at their schedule. You can also go to myseek.org and take a look about what's going on here on the island, some of the initiatives, and you'll find the content of today's radio show under the radio show link on myseek.org. The vision is really one this year of having coordinated green clubs along all of the West Coast, and over the last week we've had very positive momentum in the formation of green clubs that will follow the model of Kamala. In Kamala we've got now full support from all of the hotels, the local orbiter, local NGOs, the local community, and indeed getting people joining us from other beach communities nearby. The next green clubs to form will be the Northern Hotel chapter, which is setting it up for a Natine from Maikau Beach. We've got an individual Sally plus Diwa Hotel and Indigo Pearl doing Nanyang. We have Nick Franklin over at CBRE spearheading Niton Beach. We've got a number of supporters for starting Bangtao, which will include Bliss and Zana Beach. Then going down into Surin, myself and Ayara will be spearheading that program. In Kamala, they're working extremely well, including recently raising money for recycling stations, which you'll see around the Kamala area now, first ones of its kind in Phuket. Patong is being organised by Seek and by Quetta over in Absolute. That will be quite a large organisation working very closely with the Orbiter and the mayor. And then going south, we have the Hilton has agreed to be the sponsor and the coordinator for the Karon Beach Green Club. Katatani will be looking after the Kata Beach Green Club. And in the south, the O2 Beach Club, Colin and the team over there, are going to be spearheading the south, which will include Naihan and Rawai. So we have 10 green clubs in the process of formation, all taking this similar format. So you'll get great coordination now for beach cleanups, for community activities such as pulling together financing for recycling stations, educating local businesses, educating local restaurants, cutting down straws, cutting down plastic, cutting down consumer waste, increasing composting percentages, and generally helping us all to make our island a better island. Stay tuned. This is Nick Anthony, and you're on the Going Green Show.
This is Going Green with Nick Anthony on Live 89.5.
Nick Anthony, welcome back to the Going Green Show. We've got an alert here on the west coast of Phuket. The storms that have been coming up over the last week have been throwing trash off the oceans and back onto our beaches. We've seen an increasing amount of trash, and over the next 2 months we're going to continue to have a problem as a lot of plastic, bottles, etc. that's been floating around will, with these monsoons, get blown onto our beaches. Of course, if we don't pick it up, our beaches are going to look trashed and our tourists will not come back. Our beaches are our lifeblood, our beaches are our breadbasket, and we all have a responsibility to help to maintain them. So please, if you do go down for a swim, if you have a spare half an hour, take a plastic bag and pop down to the beach and pick up some trash and see if you can help to make the place a better one. We are doing an art project, so we are collecting any ocean trash that comes from the fishing boats, nets, ropes, bulbs, floats, fishing traps, anything like that we're collecting. We're collecting flip-flops, lighters, bottle caps, and any plastic items you think that would be interesting for an art project. So do keep those items, as well as Red Bull bottles, the small brown bottles that you'll find washing up. Please do keep them all separate, give them a rinse, let them dry, and when you've got a week or a month's worth, give us a call over at Seek or send us an email, and we'll arrange to have them picked up and used for an art project. So that's something that will be fun, and we should have some good things to show by the end of the year. Well, of course, we are in a crisis, but it's up to all of us to make a difference. We have a beach cleanup on the 21st, which is on Tuesday. That'll be in Kamala Beach on the north end in front of the Andara Beach Club. So that's 10 o'clock on Tuesday. And then the next cleanup on Kamala will then be the 28th, the following Tuesday. And we're back again in the south end of Kamala Beach in front of Rockfish. Well, the first things that, of course, you need to do is to reflect and to think about your actions. Refuse single-use plastic bags, straws and polystyrene. Reduce your waste and reduce energy use. Reuse what you can, including composting, and then recycle as much of what's left as you can. Be responsible to Phuket and be responsible to our planet. On behalf of all the team here at 89.5, we hope you have a fantastic weekend. Thank you very much for listening to the show. I do hope you enjoyed the discussion on retail from Jeremy Tang. We'll endeavour to get it up on the playback so that you can re-listen to this or forward the show to other people you think would be interested. Do stay tuned every Saturday, 3 to 5 p.m. for the Going Green Show, interviewing people that are doing good things, trying to change the planet, and looking at local actions. Stay tuned this evening. We've got a great evening of music, and of course tomorrow a full lineup again here on 89.5. So stay tuned. This is the station to listen to. Nick Anthony signing out for another Going Green Show.